I want to pull us back to the first reading from the book of Acts. And this may seem strange to you, but what strikes me most about that story is not that Tabitha or Dorcas was brought back to life, or that Peter was able to raise people from the dead, which led to witnesses believing in the Lord, which apparently was the result of this event. Until yesterday, I thought of the beginning of this sermon a little bit differently than I am right now. Those of you who were not here at the very beginning of worship did not hear the announcement that a 29-year-old man died of a drug overdose in one of the bathrooms here at Calvary. And so I think about when I hear stories of resurrection, I can't help but think of those tragic stories of death that surround us. And we can't take a kind of a rah-rah attitude when we hear stories about someone being raised from the dead in the Bible, because we know that death and resurrection are much more complicated, let us put it that way, in our own lives. So I'm going to keep going with this and say that what strikes me most about this story is not the great event of Dorcas being raised from the dead, but rather the description of what happens among Dorcas's community, that there were those who stood beside Peter weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. So what is most important and impactful, I think, about this story is that Dorcas was loved. Somebody cared about her, that she was part of a community. We can think of the young man who died yesterday, too, the same way. Someone was surrounding this person in love and is now grieving. Dorcas lived a meaningful life of service. She loved and was loved. This would have been true in her living or in her dying, in any circumstance. For most of us, we experience resurrection more subtly than what happens in this story. And we await its final effect when, as is promised in Revelation, another reading for today, we come out of the great ordeal and we are guided finally to springs of the water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. So in this present moment, we bind ourselves to communities that gather in hope, that proclaim that new life is possible, that are honest about their grief, that do all of these things not just for us, but for all, and not just for people, but for all of creation. The greater Christian community, like the saints and widows standing around Dorcas in the story from Acts, the greater Christian community is remembering two gifted people of faith, what I would call two servants of hope and inclusion and the gospel who died this past week. Both of these people were eulogized in the New York Times. That's how big their names were and how much impact they had. And yet they devoted themselves to being accessible and to tending to those on the margins. The first person, Rachel Held Evans, died tragically last Saturday, not yesterday, but the Saturday before, at the age of 37. Rachel grew up in a fundamentalist Christian family in Tennessee and attended a small conservative college. She started her career as a newspaper reporter and columnist, and then began writing about her own faith and her personal struggles with what she had been taught as a child and young adult in a very conservative Christian environment. In just a relatively short amount of time, she became one of the most influential figures in what we might call the progressive Christian movement. An article in The Atlantic this week was entitled, "Rachel Held Evans, Hero to Christian Misfits." Aren't we all misfits? Rachel eventually became an Episcopalian, but she offered hope to her former fellow evangelicals who were longing for a more inclusive and open church. According to her friend Jeffrey Chu, Rachel didn't care at all about fame, except for how it enabled her to proclaim a more just and expansive vision of God's love, to encourage others, and to amplify voices that are typically marginalized in the church and in the world. Rachel was an authentic speaker and writer who gave voice to so many. Here are some of her thoughts about the church. Imagine if every church became a place where everyone is safe, but no one is comfortable. Imagine if every church became a place where we told one another the truth. We might just create sanctuary. In my struggle to find the church, I've often felt that if I could just find the right denomination or the right congregation, if I could just become the right person or believe the right things, then my search would be over at last. But right's got nothing to do with it. Waiting around for right will leave you waiting around forever. The church is God saying, I'm throwing a banquet, and all these mismatched, messed up people are invited. Here, now have some wine. The other person who died this week, Jean Vanier, lived to be 90. He lived, unlike Rachel, a good, long life. Like Rachel Held Evans, Vanier was drawn to accompany people on the margins, people who were vulnerable. He was a French Canadian and on a path to become a career naval officer. He eventually left the Navy and began teaching philosophy. According to the New York Times, the turning point in his life came in 1963 with his first visit to an institution for people with intellectual disabilities. He was so moved by their pleas for help that he bought a house and invited 2 male residents to live with him. It was the beginning of L'Arche, or the Ark. He helped found a similar group, Faith and Light, a few years later. Today, the Ark, rooted in the Roman Catholic Church, has 154 communities in 38 countries. The closest one to here is in Clinton, Iowa. Faith and Light has 1,500 communities in 83 countries. Through both organizations, people with and without intellectual disabilities live together in a community where they can feel they belong. In his book, Becoming Human, Vanier wrote, "Every child, every person needs to know that they are a source of joy. Every child, every person needs to be celebrated. Only when all our weaknesses are accepted as part of our humanity can our negative, broken self-images be transformed." Following in the footsteps of Dorcas and Peter and so many saints, these 2 gifted people, Rachel and Jean, sought to build an inclusive community that reflected God's expansive love. They trusted in the promise of the gospel, that even in death, we are held in God's abiding presence and care. Nothing, not even death, can snatch us out of God's hand. This is the promise of the Good Shepherd. I'm not a big fan of taglines, especially when it's related to the church, but this one seems fitting today, or at least partially so. Several years ago, there was a congregation that had the following, I think they called it a mission statement. For me, it was more of a tagline. It was this: belong, believe, become. Now, before I say anything positive, I have to say something negative. I'm not sure about the last part, become. Become what? You know, is it like the Marine Corps, become the best you can be? Become a super believer? It sounds very utilitarian if you take it apart that way. However, what does work for me are the first two lines, or the first two words, and that is, for most of us, it is only through belonging that we come to believe. And of course, trust is actually a better word than belief, but it doesn't start with B. Even when we do come to trust in God, we need to belong to a community. We need to belong to a community in order to process our doubts, which are very much a part of belief. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to practice our faith alone. According to Jesus in the gospel, the reason that the Judeans, or the religious establishment who are nipping at his heels, could not believe is that they didn't belong to the shepherd. They resisted the new thing that Jesus represented about God, and they didn't come along. They didn't participate in the journey. Jesus says to those who confront him about his identity, they want to know who he is, he says, instead of answering their question, he says to them, "You do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep." Which sounds harsh. What about all the times I doubt and teeter on the edge of unbelief? Which is pretty much, we all struggle to trust. And so we are all challenged by the words of Jesus, but also included in those who know the voice. Rachel Held Evans wrote, "It's just death and resurrection over and over again, day after day, as God reaches down into our deepest graves and with the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, wrests us from our pride, our apathy, our fear, our prejudice, our anger, our hurt, and our despair. Most days I don't know which is harder for me to believe, that God reanimated the brain functions of a man 3 days dead, or that God can bring back to life all the beautiful things we have killed. Both seem pretty unlikely to me." She speaks for many of us as we seek to apply the resurrection promise to our lives and to the life of the world around us. The only way that we don't fall into despair, the only way we get anything done, the only way for us to be reminded of the resurrection promise is for us to belong, is for us to be in this together. Thanks to Rachel Held Evans and John Vanier for reminding us of that truth. Amen.